Welcome to this video of Swami Nirgunananda Ji. This is the first of a series of question and answers videos that Swamiji has agreed to record. And so they will be posted regularly. And these questions that are going to be addressed in this session were posted by elements of Swamiji's Sangha, so his followers and his students. But you can also post your questions. In the description of this video, you will find a link to the forum, so you can put your own questions to Swamiji that will be answered in a future session. So for now, let's start. Good morning, Swamiji.
Namaste. Good morning.
Namaste. Good morning.
Thanks to start this session, fresh question and answers that we have received from people.
Yes. So our first question, can you explain the primary difference between the path of yoga versus the path of Vedanta?
Yeah, so this is a more fundamental understanding that we need. Both of these are different schools of Indian philosophy. As we know, the path of yoga is one of the Shat Darshans, we say, the six recognized philosophies of Indian schools. And so the path of yoga is one of them. And Vedanta is another school. But both of these belong to, we can say, the orthodox or the so-called theistic kind of schools, Shat Darshan, Astika Darshans. So there is a lot of similarities, primarily because both of them are somewhat contemplative in nature. Meaning both of them are requiring us to do a certain, like a sadhana in both of them. The yoga path of sadhana entails a lot of, rigorous steps, physical, pranic, mental, intellectual. But the Vedanta path is primarily, of course, based on mind and intellect. But it requires a certain pre-qualification most of the times. And so this pre-qualification to be fit and ready to absorb the teachings of Vedanta is what a lot of times is provided by yoga sadhana. So at the same time, if you ask a strictly yogic practitioner, they don't necessarily say that you need Vedanta to get to the final realization. That kaivalya that is talked about in yoga, which is the final liberation, is not necessarily a one has to understand all the teachings of Vedanta. It is a personal experience and an ability to discern between consciousness and matter, Purusha and Prakriti. And has in one of the famous sutras of yoga in Patanjali, in that he explains that state of how one comes to that final state of realization, and it is called as Tada Drishtu Swarupe Avasthanam, when the seer abides in one's own true nature, true form. So this is where, the ultimate goal is similar to what Vedanta also says, where, one comes to that realization of self. One comes to that Atmajnana, or that understanding of that oneness between self and that supreme reality. So yoga and Vedanta are very similar in their things. And the primary difference between these two paths is mostly in the sadhana, in how we approach it, how we practice it. So the sadhana for yoga involves physical, prana, mental, and all this, working with all this. So it's somewhat more practical to a lot of people, because they start seeing tangible benefits right away in their life. Like when you do yoga asanas, you'll start seeing physical benefits. When you learn pranayama, you will see mental and physical benefits. And of course, with meditation and all that, you will improve your concentration, ability to focus the mind, ability to tap into higher sources of intelligence, All this is where yoga is the sadhana is based on that. And that requires a very specific focus and very detailed time. I mean, like a proper time you give to that. Vedanta, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily need you. I mean, especially for the sadhana, Vedanta sadhana, you don't necessarily need to be in a quiet place, cut off from the world, and you're always in that state of contemplation. Although to really study that Shastra, to really understand Vedanta, you need all that. So that in a way is that fundamental difference in how we do the sadhana. Once you study the Vedanta sadhana, which requires a certain amount of concentration, seclusion, and being with that Acharya and all that, then that actual sadhana of Vedanta can be done anytime. So that is the most important difference. And of course, philosophically, there is difference. Yoga in one way is still somewhat of a dualistic school. And what we say, especially for Advaita Vedanta, it is a non-dualistic school.
So the second question is, what advice would you give to beginners looking to approach yoga as a spiritual journey rather than just fitness?
Based on its complete understanding of yoga as a philosophy, is aimed to giving us that final liberation, moksha. So in no way is yoga just for the sake of physical exercise or even for the sake of pure psychological well-being, although it does offer all that. So in one way, the popularity of yoga today is based on that it helps us physically, mentally, emotionally, and many such benefits. And it is okay. It's not bad if somebody has come to yoga based on those those promotions for that. But yet at the same time, the potential of yoga and what you can really get from yoga, and really where yoga is leading to, is that final liberation, which is discussed in all the Indian teachings and spiritual scriptures. So yoga, we say, is although recently meaning in this last 2000 years, that the last 2 centuries, it has become a very well accepted philosophical school. Yogis as such were always there. So yogis were probably the most ancient spiritual practitioners who have always ever been there. So even before Buddhism, for example, the one who Buddha saw and was motivated to seek liberation or nirvana was a sadhu, a yogi. And we say that, that if there is even one yogi in this world who is there with proper realization, he has the capacity to get back all the scriptures. So in that sense, a yogi is much more superior to all the other spiritual practitioners. So so there is a much greater potential in yoga, and it is a complete spiritual journey if we really understand the proper philosophy of it. There are many scriptures that extol the teachings and explain the teachings of yoga, but the most ancient and the most well accepted one is the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, which gives us that complete journey on how we can attain that kaivalya, that final liberation. So see, this is where we have undersold the potential of yoga. It is okay if we come to yoga for the sake of fitness or for psychological well-being, but the real potential of yoga, you will get unlimited fitness and eternal psychological well-being when you really understand its complete teachings and put it to practice. Then you're not just going through ups and downs in life, at least psychologically and emotionally. That is in Bhagavad Gita also, we have the teachings of yoga. So there it says samatvam yoga muchyate. So that abilities of state of mind where we are well balanced, we are poised in our day-to-day life. That practical benefits also we can get based on the teachings of yoga.
How can we differentiate between our true self and our egoic self? And are there any practical approaches to self-inquiry?
So this question already admits that there is the path of self-inquiry. And as some of us might already know that self-inquiry is the approach that has become popular or was put in place to a large extent due to Ramana Maharshi. And Ramana Maharshi's teachings, which in a very succinct way talks about who am I, and that is a path that path and practice that he gave to all the sadhakas. So self-inquiry, when we say the word self-inquiry, it is very clearly trying to bring us to the realization that there is a more superior and a more purer self than the ego self. So the word self, when we talk from this context, that which S, which starts with that lowercase or the S in that first letter S, which if it is a lowercase s, then that self is not the pure self, the highest self. It is the egoic self. And that self, which we talk about from the scriptures, the Indian scriptures, which is the highest realization of all sadhana, is usually with capital S, the S in the SELF. So that self, which we want to realize, or sometimes called a self-realization, that self-realization needs us to understand and transcend that ego. So the process of our spiritual journey from this context or this kind of sadhana requires us to know that there is an ego self. And this ego self is what I'm identified with. So identification of ego self happens through many ways. One is a very pure physical identification, that I am this body and no more. So this is the ego identifies with the body. Then the next level of identification can also happen at the different society level. I'm the son of so and so, or I have such and such a job, or I have such and such a husband, wife. See, all this in relation to another entity, another person. We assume I am this based on another person. So that also is an egoic self. And here comes a lot of different stages of our emotions which connect to that ego and make that ego big or small. Like if I am a very successful person, then that ego becomes very proud. It is a very proud ego. If I'm an unsuccessful person, then that ego has it has low self-esteem, as they say, meaning there is also an ego there. There is an ego identification, but this ego identification thinks that I am lesser than others, and that also is a problem because that is not the true nature of who we are. So similarly, at the worldly level, like we are not able to even function sometimes if we identify very closely with a certain society, family, and other things. Like if somebody, he is a very good musician or a poet or somebody, or if he is born to a family which has pure, which is a history of being in business or being doctors, then there is a lot of pressure that identification drives that person to go according to the society. See, all this is again a where ego identification crosses the problem. And the biggest challenge of egoic identification and not knowing our true nature comes in relationships. Every relationship, people, not just husband, wife, or partners. Every relationship, that element of ego, when that is dominant, it inhibits our ability to have unconditional love. It doesn't allow us to have a common understanding with people and work from that level of pure well-being for that relationship. So this is the challenge of ego, and we don't realize that ego is what keeps us from realizing that pure happiness, that pure joy. So this path of self-inquiry, what it does is, first it wants us to identify, first it wants us to recognize that we are identified with the ego most of the time. And then there is the pointing. What is the pointing is that there is a higher identification we have, purer identification, and that it is worthwhile to seek that identification. Because unless we come to that pure identification of who we are, we will not have proper happiness. Our life will always be up and down. And most importantly, we will not come to realize what is called as purnatva, meaning completeness. We will always feel insecure, we'll always feel incomplete, because that is the nature of ego. The ego tends to divide us. The ego tends to make me separate from others. And as long as that separation is there, we will not know that unity, that one universal nature of consciousness, or that true, like it is like, when a wave, as long the wave is identified as the wave, it will not know its root, it will not know its source in the ocean. It will always think I am the wave. And so then there is competition. Am I bigger than this wave? Am I smaller than that wave? I'm just humanizing. The wave probably doesn't think like that, but I'm putting that human emotions to that. Okay, so this is the path of self-inquiry, and the best and the most profound example of this was Ramana Maharshi, because he took just this one path as being adequate. And from there, actually, from the teachings of Ramana Maharshi now, both in East and in West, there are so many teachers who have some kind of connection or root to that teaching, or that format of his teaching. Of course, even like Buddhism and yoga and all that are also trying to free us from the ego. But the most important thing is that in the path of self-inquiry, if we have some understanding of Vedanta, yoga, and other things, it is easier. Otherwise, we have to go on our own, and we may or may not be able to understand the different subtle nuances of the workings of ego. So when we really understand the path of yoga and Vedanta, then we will understand there are so many layers to that ego that needs to be unraveled. So two approaches. One is we discover all of that, go step by step, find out all of that. Or the other approach is we directly try to abide in that pure nature of consciousness. But again, like sometimes what happens is, for many people, when we talk about Atman, consciousness and all that, it becomes a very theoretical, intellectual understanding. So they are not able to see through that layers of ego, and yet that ego takes a very subtle intellect layer of identification, mental and intellect layer of identification, and thinks that it is okay, it is already free because it is studying the Shastras, it is got this. So there is where, we have to really we can really benefit if we are on a constant self-introspection on a daily basis. So the journey of a spiritual sadhaka is that he or she has to go through introspection to really see where they are, and if the subtle nuances of ego is in the underplay. Yeah.
And is there a practice, a self-inquiry practice that you can suggest that we could fit into our daily lives?
Yeah. So first thing, as I mentioned, is there is, if formal practice that we should keep some time for, meaning we should take some time to do some formal practice, like I mentioned, end of the day, doing a little bit introspection. Like today, what was my most dominant personality or emotion I went through? And if you had any challenges, just to take some time, either at the end of the day or just as you wake up. So these are some things that will trigger us to train the mind to be aware, to be vigilant. Then again, the other thing is to start off with the morning with that clear intention, like this is called, and something as that, I think it's called as prospective memory, meaning like you tell your mind that today as I go through this, all my activities, I will be vigilant. I will be aware that whenever my ego rises, especially if you're aware of certain patterns, that I will be mindful or I'll be aware when something like this happens. And most importantly, after having set that intention, so this is also called a sankalpa, like we set a daily sankalpa, I'll be more aware to catch myself when I go through these patterns. I will remind myself. And of course, if you have some partner or some friend who's also on the spiritual path, you can have some agreement, like they can give you some cues or signs. So both of you can help each other. But most importantly, we have to have our intention very clear. That sankalpa has to be very clear in us. And then, as I mentioned, what is called these days as mindfulness is partly also related to this, where we are using certain triggers, physical like sensations or breath or something, and we try to be in touch with that. And when we realize that there is some a spike in our breath, or if there is shallowness in the breath or certain sensations, we have to immediately realize that our intellect is being troubled, meaning our ego is being threatened, or our ego has risen, because that one is that change in physical sensations based on our worldly activities, like if there is hot or cold and other things, or if you've eaten something. Another is a psychological sensation and psychological change that is induced in physical sensations and breath. So when we become a little more mindful to these things, we can catch that ego at play. And another thing is the essence of self-inquiry path is based on this question, which Ramana Maharshi has put in a very nice way. Just asking ourselves every now and then, who am I? Meaning that where am I identified with? What is it that is my greatest focus at this point? Meaning, is that focus on myself, or is that focus on others, or is that focus on my desires? See, this is where, the real path of self-inquiry is a day-to-day path of inquiry. Every now and then, we should kind of, if possible, take a pause and just see what am I identified with right now, and what is dominating my mind, meaning like, is there some strong desire or hatred or anything? So all these emotions, we experience, especially if we boil it down to two strong emotions, what we call as raga dvesha, excessive obsession and likes, and excessive hatred or dislike. Whenever these two are at play, the root of them is ahankara, that ego has taken over. So a lot of this practice is about vigilance, being aware. And the more we maintain awareness on a conscious way, so we have to formally do some practices. Like, as I said, introspection end of the day, setting an intention at the beginning of the day. These are a little formal practices. And informal practices will then come based on the momentum of these formal practices. if you're introspecting every day, there is no way that you will just be unconsciously playing out your mental patterns. So that power of daily introspection will automatically cause you to be more vigilant and aware in your daily life.
Is Buddhism similar to Advaita Vedanta in that it is also non-dualistic? And how should one start approaching Vedanta if they have a background in other forms of spirituality, like Buddhism?
When we say Vedanta, Dvaita Vedanta, that we generally say Advaita Vedanta is a non-dualistic school, and like the tradition with which I am associated, especially as a sannyasi, is with Advaita Vedanta, and most of the sannyasa tradition has, to a large extent, come from Advaita Vedanta, which is a non-dualistic school. Now, the closest school in terms of non-dualistic teachings is Buddhism. But yet, as Buddhism in itself, we cannot say is all non-dualistic. Because even in Buddhism, there are a lot of dualistic practices, just as how there is also dualistic practices in Vedanta also. In yoga, Vedanta, all that also, there are dualistic practices. But the vision of Advaita Vedanta is clearly non-dualistic. And the ultimate goal. Similarly, that vision and ultimate goal of especially that certain Buddhist schools. So in Buddhism, there are there are several schools. In our traditional philosophy, we take that, we take that 4 schools. And of course, those are like the Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamika. So these are the 4 schools which are very philosophically recognized. But in today's world, they are not exactly like that. They're not divided like that. So there are several schools, and the most well-known 3 paths of Buddhist teachings are in that Hinayana and Mahayana and Vajrayana. So these are the more commonly society-based accepted things. Like the Hinayana path is more prevalent in Theravada Buddhism, like countries like Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka. They are all practitioners of the Hinayana. So there, what happens is that in the Hinayana, we cannot necessarily say it's non-dualistic because they don't accept God. Just because they don't accept God, it doesn't mean they are non-dualistic. They are dualistic in different ways. It's like even accepting that the world and the mind, or the subject and object, is like how the many mindfulness practices are based on that. There is a subject, there is an object. So at that level, that final goal from that perspective of freeing that mind will never happen, because there is still a dualistic split in a very different way. So that kind of thing is still predominantly dualistic there. So if you are meditating on an object, that object makes that dualism there. So again, it may be religiously and spiritually non-dualistic, but it may not be psychologically non-dualistic. Now comes other schools like Mahayana and especially Vajrayana. So in Mahayana and Vajrayana, they are very clear identifications where people do say it is non-dualistic. Especially there is a very famous teachings of Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna was actually in India, and he was a learned person who became a Buddhist, and he wrote the text called as Mula Madhyama Karika. So Mula Madhyamika Karika. So that in that he established what is now well known as emptiness, school of emptiness, or Shunyata. So that school is to a large extent non-dualistic, and many other schools that came from there later on are also non-dualistic, because they don't accept any kind of separation. Just as how in Vedanta we say that Purnatva, similarly they accept that Shunyata. And these two are nothing but, in one way, just terminologies used to point to that highest reality. So both the non-dualistic approaches are prevalent in Vedanta and in Buddhism. But we cannot say all of Buddhism is non-dualistic. And similarly, we cannot say all of Vedic Shastras are non-dualistic. The vision, the ultimate vision in Advaita Vedanta is clearly non-dualistic. And this is that victory, that Digvijaya, that Shankaracharya established when he went all around the country and defeated every school to establish the, defeated in debate, by discussion and debate, that supremacy of Vedanta. But in our experiential way, many times what happens is Buddhism is much more, I feel, although I follow now predominantly the Advaita Vedanta school, that ability to point to that non-dual reality through direct pointers is greater in Buddhism in many ways. The Advaita Vedanta, from formal study and all that, it is much more superior. But in terms of the practitioner, the ability to directly grasp, and this we see in that many Mahayana paths of Zen, the Zen paths, practitioners, where they try to practice this no mind. So there are many stories of people who awakened just in a flash, to that highest reality. But ideally, from a realistic understanding of all philosophies, this happens only if that person has had some samskara, meaning some kind of a previous conditioning to point to that reality. So, I think Buddhism is definitely one of the paths which is very well developed to point us to that higher reality. But of course, like it is personality based. There are a lot of challenges in having that complete understanding in Buddhism, because a lot of things Buddha didn't clearly explain. So that is that shortcoming that Advaita Vedanta has covered up, especially after Shankaracharya has established that. So a lot of that questions that was unanswered, where different schools and different splits happened in Buddhism, that was mainly because of non-clarity of that proper teachings. Because Buddha said, you be a light, a lamp unto yourself, meaning you find out that truth yourself. So as a philosophical school, sometimes that challenge is there, which Vedanta in one way has attempted to cover all the explanations. Okay, we'll do that one more and then we will finish that last question.
Swamiji, can you please clarify regarding Dvaita Vedanta and Advaita Vedanta? In Dvaita, a clear line of two entities, Jiva and Atma, is separated and the world is somehow considered real. Is Dvaita more like a path of devotion to God?
Yeah, that last part is correct. Dvaita is based on a path of devotion to God, primarily Bhakti Marga. And we see that, many Dvaita Sampradayas started, especially as a philosophical darshana based on the Upanishad translations that Madhvacharya and Ramanujacharya also, that is Visishta Advaita, but it has a Dvaita component to that. So these were the prominent acharyas. And then also a lot of teachings of the Achintya Veda from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, that Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna. They're also very, very popular, and Dvaita Sampradaya. So see, there is basically one point here to understand is, like I think that question that that the questionnaire asked, it's not that that much of a clear line between Jiva and Atma. What the clear line in Dvaita is between the components of that Ishvara or Paramatma, we say, and Atma or Jiva. So the distinction is between Paramatma or Ishvara and Jiva. And then there is one more component they have added, or which is there in all philosophies, and they have also made a distinction between Jagat. So the differentiation is between Ishvara, Jiva, Jagat. Ishvara is God, Jiva is the individual, and Jagat is the world. So these two are very clearly distinguished. They are all separated out. So this is the fundamental difference. If we put it in a simple way, of course, there are a lot of other differences between Advaita Vedanta and Dvaita Vedanta of any sorts. So the Ishvara is that God or the Paramatma. So from that God is given the highest reality, supreme reality. So from there, what has happened? All these jivas have come, meaning they have become different, and they have been irrevocably separated, meaning they have been separated in a realistic way, like not like how we say in Advaita Vedanta, where that consciousness itself is reflected, or that consciousness due to ignorance imagines itself to be jiva. It is not like that. Here, like there is a very clear distinction. So what happens? That jiva can never become Paramatma again. That jiva can never again become Ishvara. So the mukti is also relative mukti. You can be in the same place as God. Salokya mukti or sayujya mukti, meaning in proximity. Samipya and sayujya is their highest. So all this like levels where you're not completely one. You don't become one again. There'll always be that difference. And then the questionnaire put the other point that is also correct. Then the world becomes real. Meaning that world is not like Maya, Mithya, like we say, which famous quote with Shankaracharya says, Jagat Satya, Jagat Mithya, the Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya, Jivo Brahmaiva Napara. That is Shankaracharya's quote, which establishes Vedanta, where he says that Brahman, Brahman or Ishvara is is the only reality. And then what happens? The Jagat is not real. It appears like a dream. It has come and it goes. So when you're dreaming, it is real, but you will not stay always in that dreaming state. So that ultimate reality is again that one consciousness, Brahman. And there is no distinction, he says, Jivo, Brahmaiva, Napara. There is no distinction between these two. But this distinction, which has happened according to Dvaita Vedanta, is irrevocable, meaning that individual can be in proximity or one in terms of identification through that devotion. Through the devotion, one can attain that identification with God, but in reality will never become one with God. So that is where the path of devotion is extolled. You have to worship that God because he or she is that final boss. Like if you are working in a company, you cannot talk negative about the CEO. If you want to be in that company, right? So that CEO here, in that sense, you have to adore, you have to worship that CEO, and there is a lot of benefits. I mean, that path of Dvaita, in one way, helps us to cultivate devotion, and devotion is an important aspect of sadhana. So, whether we have devotion to God or Guru or the scriptures, that element of channelizing the energy of that heart is really devotion. But if we have to take this kind of understanding to induce that devotion, it is fine. But ideally, we have to learn to work directly with devotion. So if we can learn to work directly with devotion, then we can channelize that energy as per the requirement of our sadhana. You can channelize a devotion to the Guru, to God, or to Shastras as per necessary. So in one way, devotion from a yogic perspective, it is learning to channel that emotions, that energy of that emotions into a pure pure channel. So Dvaita does that by what? By just how religions do. Every religion does that. You have to buy into that. But at the same time, what happens is there will always be some challenges, because if somebody doesn't buy into your understanding, then there will be conflict, because you have used that faith alone. So Dvaita Sampradaya requires that faith, that like investigation, like inquiry, like we just mentioned, self-inquiry, or contemplation, inquiry, and all that. Doesn't have a lot of scope. It has some scope, but not a lot of scope. So the Dvaita approach is helpful to cultivate devotion, but not necessarily to move on the path of inquiry and contemplation. And that is where Advaita Vedanta has come, and especially Advaita Vedanta does not have a direct fight with Dvaita, although Dvaitins have a fight with Advaitins. From an Advaita perspective, what they are talking about is a relative truth. So it is not like it is completely unreal. So that relative truth is accepted. But Advaita Vedanta encourages us to move further to that highest reality, that highest ultimate truth.
It seems like though, like in Dvaita Vedanta, there may be like a pull for the person to even stay in samsara in order to continue to develop that relationship with the deity and not really get liberated, because how is the concept of liberation for them? It's just an encounter with divinity. It's not like in Advaita Vedanta realizing you are it. In Dvaita, you are not it, correct?
Correct. So in Dvaita, that even that word Tattvamasi, they have changed its meaning. See, this is what, Sanskrit is so wide, so you can tweak the meanings using Sanskrit things. And so there they are saying that conditioned Brahman is that unconditioned Brahman, Tattvamasi. It is not talking about you and God. So the identification. So yeah, but your point is correct. The difference is that Dvaita also wants to give us moksha. It is not that it is trying to keep us in the samsara, but that moksha is that you be near or you be in the proximity of the Lord. So it is trying to free us from samsara. In like how we are going through samsara, it also wants to free us from that. But the challenge is when that vision is limited, our efforts also will be towards that limited vision. So if we are working under the premise that I have to be near to Bhagavan, then of course it is a much more exalted vision compared to where we are in our world. We are caught up completely in the samsara. So it is a much more exalted vision. But yet it is not the highest liberation. That highest liberation which we speak about is also mukti here, what is called in Vedanta as Jivan Mukti. Of course, there's Videha Mukti, but Jivan Mukti is realizing right now, right here, we are free. So how is that possible? That is possible only if I realize that even in that samsara, I can realize my true nature as consciousness. I'm not this body and mind, because the body and mind is caught in the samsara, or the jiva is caught in that samsara. I, as a pure conditioned consciousness, I'm not caught in that. So that realization will give us liberation in this world only. So Dvaita Vedanta attempts to bring us to a more protected, safer kind of zone, and by even being under the blessing and of God, or being under the so-called refuge of God and things like that. So those are necessary for sadhakas. But at the same time, it will not lead us to that final liberation, because that unconditioned reality is not pointed out. And we will have some sense of some small level of delusion still binding us. But of course, they will not look at it that they feel their mukti is the highest mukti. And so every school believes that, right? But when we look at it from a complete bigger perspective, larger perspective, that mukti is called as krama mukti, meaning it is a intermediary liberation according to Advaita Vedanta.
Got it. Understood. I think we'll leave it at this today.
Yes.
I think it's good enough. Swamiji, thank you very much for attending these questions, for addressing these questions. And we will get together again for a new video soon. People can continue to send their questions. Again, in the description of this video, you will find a link to a form where you can submit your questions to Swamiji. And Swamiji Pranam, I don't know if you want to send a last message.
Yeah, I think people who have questions, they are welcome to ask anything related to the spiritual, and especially these things of yoga, Vedanta, Buddhism related things, because those are some of the areas I have practiced and studied a little bit. So whatever I can, I will try to address that. And since it's made available online also, so those who have any follow-up questions related to today's also can ask, send in their questions, and we will do our best. And sometimes I think we may have to rephrase that question a little bit so that it's easier for the other audience to understand. So the couple of my students who are helping me with this are been able to do that. And I'd just like to close with a closing prayer. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevava Shishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namah.